Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's jump right into this today by tackling a really fundamental question about how you actually interact with the universe around you. Because whether you consider yourself deeply religious, highly spiritual, or honestly, just someone trying to figure out how your own mind works, you've probably hit a wall when it comes to the concepts of prayer and manifestation. We talk about them all the time, right? But the actual literal mechanics behind them can feel incredibly mysterious.
And that brings us to this. Are you asking the universe or are you commanding it? This exact question recently sparked a massive, super passionate debate online. People were really trying to pin down the actual difference between traditional prayer and the modern law of attraction. Like, are you pleading with the higher power or are you assuming that power yourself? It sounds like an unanswerable philosophical riddle, but what if I told you the answer actually lies in a master map of human consciousness?
Here's our roadmap for this explainer today. 1. Prayer versus the law of attraction. 2. Mapping the psyche. 3. Finding the personal I. 4. Navigating the superconscious trap. And 5. Reaching the transpersonal self.
All right, section 1, prayer versus the law of attraction.
So over on the Law of Attraction subreddit, a user who was feeling pretty hopeless sparked a fascinating debate. And what's great is that this strips away all the heavy academic jargon and just looks at how real people are trying to make things happen in their everyday lives. They were confused about the fundamental difference between praying for something and manifesting it, and the community brilliantly broke it down. They pointed out that prayer is typically an intercession. It's petitionary. You're asking a higher power for something you don't currently have, relying totally on faith that God or the universe is going to provide it. On the flip side, the law of attraction basically skips the asking phase altogether. It operates on assuming the desire is already fulfilled. You aren't asking, you are taking on the feeling of knowing and being.
I absolutely love how one user, IamN30, perfectly summarized this. They wrote, shift faith into knowing and boom, you are a manifestor. As the community noted, both of these approaches fundamentally utilize faith and belief, but they represent entirely different mechanics for accessing the exact same parts of our psyche. One feels like a child asking a loving parent, while the other feels like you're generating the reality yourself. But to understand how both of these can exist and actually work, we're going to need a map.
Which brings us to section 2, mapping the human psyche.
Take a look at this. This egg-shaped diagram of psychosynthesis is going to act as our visual anchor for today. So we're moving from a modern internet forum to a foundational psychological framework built by early 20th century psychiatrist Roberto Assagioli. Now, I know it might look a little abstract at first glance, but it brilliantly illustrates that these different spiritual practices, asking and commanding, are actually just different zones within our very own minds. It proves that the difference between our personality and these higher spiritual realms is really one of level, not of nature.
So Assagioli defines these 7 distinct zones of the psyche. You've got the lower, middle, and higher unconscious, with the higher one being the superconscious. Then you have the field of consciousness right in the middle, anchored by the conscious self, the I, which is that center dot. And at the very top, shining like a star, is the transpersonal self, all surrounded by the collective unconscious. Now, for our purposes today, to solve our big debate, we are going to focus entirely on the vertical journey straight upward from that center point.
Let's dive into section 3, finding the personal I.
Because here's the thing. Before we can reach any higher spiritual realms, before we can manifest or pray effectively, we've got to first establish our personal center. We literally have to figure out who is actually doing the asking. The absolutely crucial point here is that your true I is not your thoughts or your emotions or your desires or impulses. We spend practically our entire lives mistaking ourselves for these fleeting contents. You might say, I am sad or I am angry, but Assagioli points out that the true I is just the silent observer and director. It's completely distinct from the contents of consciousness. It is your focal point of awareness and will.
Assagioli gives us a literal step-by-step for moving upward. First, you must actively relinquish that mistaken sense of being your emotions. You disidentify from them. You don't suppress them, you just recognize you are the observer using them. Once you anchor yourself in the true I, only then can your will become strong enough to ascend upward through the superconscious and align with the transpersonal self. Trust me, if you try to skip the I, you are going to get lost.
Moving on to section 4, navigating the superconscious trap.
All right, as we follow the map upward from the I, we enter a fascinating and highly active region called the superconscious. And guys, this is where it gets highly relevant to our law of attraction debate. The superconscious is a higher region of intense activity, diversity, ecstatic visions, the creative flashes of the artist, transformative symbols, the whole shebang. It's full of dynamic processes and changing energies. Manifestation and the law of attraction heavily utilize this exact superconscious zone. When you use your imagination to literally feel a reality that hasn't happened yet, you are interacting with these archetypes and symbols as transmitters of energy. But there is a hidden danger here. Because these transpersonal states are so joyous, ecstatic, and alluring, we can become completely enmeshed in them. We can actually mistake the intense, dazzling activity of the superconscious for ultimate reality itself. The famous psychologist Abraham Maslow called this exact trap higher sidetracking. Basically, we get so caught up in the beautiful visions, the manifestations, and these peak experiences that we literally stop climbing. We get completely sidetracked by the phenomena.
Finally, Section 5, Reaching the Transpersonal Self. This brings us to the ultimate destination of both deep prayer and psychological ascension. Beyond the busy activity of the superconscious sits the transpersonal self. To explain the difference between the superconscious and the transpersonal self, Assagioli uses this brilliant metaphor. He compares the transpersonal self to the steady, unchanging hinge of a door. The superconscious is the door itself, constantly swinging back and forth in motion. The self is ontological, which basically means it's about pure being. It's not a process, it's something standing in itself. It's the cause of all the processes, but it doesn't move.
Think of the transpersonal self like a lighthouse sweeping its beam, or an electrical generator out in a remote location sending voltage into a busy city. It sends out a steady, pure energy. This energy pervades all the changing, active processes of the superconscious mind without ever moving itself. It is the unmoved mover. It has absolutely no specific dimensions, limits, or changing qualities.
So, bringing this all the way back to our initial Reddit debate, this map completely validates both sides. We can see the deep, intercessory prayer often seeks this steady, unmoved transpersonal self, the generator at the source, that pure state of being. Meanwhile, the law of attraction works actively within the swinging door of the superconscious, utilizing symbols, imagination, and changing energies to manifest reality. They aren't mutually exclusive at all. They are just utilizing entirely different tools on the exact same vertical axis of human consciousness.
And here is where it all culminates. Assagioli shares this incredibly beautiful paradox of selfhood from Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. He reveals that at the peak of this journey, when your personal I successfully reaches the transpersonal self, we don't just disappear like a drop into the ocean. Instead, uniqueness and universality grow together. You get to experience absolute, expansive universality without ever losing your unique individuality. The most unique literally becomes the most universal.
So, knowing now that asking and commanding are simply different mechanics on the exact same beautiful map of consciousness, we've got to ask ourselves a really practical question. If both the steady hinge of pure being and the swinging door of active creation are available inside you right now, how will you choose to align your personal will today to connect with your highest self? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.